Good evening. Let me just stop sharing this. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. Welcome to the Slaveryarchive Book Club. Today we are here to discuss the book Slave Trade and Abolition, Gender, Commerce, and Economic Transition in Luanda by Vanessa Oliveira. And let me introduce us before. Okay, you are hearing an echo, but people who are on YouTube are not hearing that. Let me just then introduce you Alex Hill, who is our co-host at Columbia University, and also introduce our co-host Vanessa Holden, who is also a Vanessa, and she'll be presenting soon also at the Slaveryarchive Book Club. And Vanessa is also our co-host, and she's an associate professor of history at University of Kentucky. Also Jessica Marie Johnson, she is our co-host. She's not here yet. We are going to see if she'll be able to come today. If not, she has been with us during all the organization of this event. Then again, this is the book that you are discussing today, published February of this year, then by University of Wisconsin Press, Slave Trade and Abolition, Gender, Commerce, and Economic Transition in Luanda. The author is historian Vanessa Oliveira. Vanessa is an assistant professor of African history at the Royal Military College of Canada, where she teaches then early and modern African history, also European colonialism and African women's history. Professor Oliveira, she is the author of the book that you are seeing here today that we will be discussing. This is her first monograph. And she is also co-editor with Paul Lovejoy of the book Slavery, Memory, and Citizenship, which was published by Africa World Press in 2016. She has published then articles and book chapters on women merchants, intercultural marriages, and slavery in Luanda. And Dr. Oliveira also has been a member of the editorial board of the Canadian Journal of African Studies since 2019. Then now we have this presentation, a short presentation by Professor Oliveira on her book. After that, we open the floor for questions. Thank you for coming.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. And I'd like to start by thanking Ana Lúcia Araújo for the invitation and the other co-host of the Slaveryarchive Network, or the Slaveryarchive Book Club. Jessica Johnson, who is not here, I hope she'll make it, and Alex Gill and Vanessa Holden. And I also wanted to congratulate the organizers of this book club. This is the second year, and I hope it will keep going. So this has been a wonderful initiative. I've been following it, even though I'm not always able to log in, but I saw some of the videos afterwards. So I will share some slides with you. I just want to make sure it's gonna work well. So I will share that now. Let me see. Okay, can you see it there?
Yes, you can see it. Everything is fine.
Great. So slave trade and abolition examines how the merchant community of Luanda, the capital of Angola, adapted to the transformations that affect the Atlantic world through the 19th century. So in the book, I examine the strategies used by slave traders based in Luanda in face of the transformations that operated after the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade in 1836 in the case of West Central Africa. So I argue that the merchant community of Luanda was indeed able to adjust to the change that affected the South Atlantic. and many large-scale merchants survived the official suppression of the slave trade in 1836 to become the main investors in the new trade in tropical commodities such as ivory, wax, coffee, cotton, and to a lesser extent, also sugar. So the narrative of the book pays particular attention to the interactions between foreign and local people in the spheres of marriage, trade, and slave ownership. So you can see here a map of West Central Africa, and here you can see Luanda and Benguela to the south. There was the two major Portuguese-controlled ports in West Central Africa where more captives departed from this region. But you also can see here to the north the African-controlled ports of Cabinda, Ambris, Molembo, and Luango. And these ports will be especially important during the era of the illegal slave trade because most captives will live from this area. So Luanda was the single most important port of the transatlantic slave trade during the whole era of the slave traffic. And therefore, when we talk about the merchant community of Luanda, we are talking about the group of traders who exported more captives across the Atlantic Ocean. And then we might ask ourselves, who were these traders? Who were these merchants? And some fellow historians have explored the trajectories of some of these merchants before, such as Joseph Miller, José Curto, and Daniel Domingos da Silva. And so we do know a great deal of information about some of these merchants. So the merchant community of Luanda in the 19th century was composed by foreign traders and Luso-Africans. So the foreign traders were mainly Portuguese, whether they were born in Portugal itself or in Brazil. We also had some traders coming from Goa, Santo and from the islands of Azores, Madeira, and Cape Verde. Luso-Africans were people of mixed backgrounds, so they were basically the offspring of European men with African women. So these Luso-African traders, they professed Christianity, they adopted European fashion, and they lived in Portuguese-style houses that in Angola and in the Portuguese world was known as sobrados. And they spoke Portuguese and also Quimbundo. So these individuals, they were in a privileged position to become intermediaries in the slave trade because they were able to navigate in both worlds. Luso-Africans were recognized as Portuguese, and they were often classified as white in official documentation. And while some of these traders were independent merchants, meaning that they were able to manage their business with their own capital, some were agents of firms established in Brazil and in Portugal, especially in Lisbon and in Rio de Janeiro. There were the two cities that were more connected to Luanda. In Angola, as was the case in other places in West Africa, immigrant men enter relationship with African and Luso-African women. Some of these relationships end up in marriage, whether this marriage was celebrated in the Catholic Church or in the style of the country. So mostly Catholic marriage were common among the elite, especially the Luso-African elite. Some of these local wives, they were merchants before entering marriage with these European men. So especially they supplied foodstuff to the urban market and to slave ships. These local wives, they became indispensable to their European husbands. They act as commercial agents. They also act as translators and cultural brokers. And they also provided a household and healthcare that were essential for the survival of these men in the colony. So the most successful of these women merchants became known as donas, and you might be familiar with the donas from the work of Mariana Cândido and Selma Pantoja, and maybe from my own work. And this woman also benefited from these relationships, from these unions with European men that gave them access to imported goods that they could trade locally. So the early 19th century brought new opportunity for these merchants based in Angola, especially after 1815, when Britain and Portugal agreed on a treaty that limited the export of captives by Portuguese vessels to the south of the equator. So because of the treaty, there was an increase in the number of captives exported from West Central Africa, as you can see through this table. Between 1816 to 1820, that means right after the treaty, the total number of captives departing for Luanda reached about 92,500. It's an increase about 39% compared with the previous half decade. 1811 to 1815. So, and again, in the next decade, the number of captives fell but remained higher than the period before the treaty. So again, how did the merchant community of Luanda reacted to the increased demand for captives from West Central Africa? So most established merchants, they purchased larger vessels so that they could also respond to this increased demand for captives and export more slave labor to the Americas. So some merchants, they purchased like 5 vessels to increase their participation in the transatlantic slave trade, but also this growth in the slave trade in West Central Africa opened new opportunities for individuals that were not yet participating in the transatlantic slave trade. So we also have new investors entering the transatlantic slave trade. And among these new investors, there were women. And these women, they had accumulated capital through the foodstuff supply business. So these women, they had land and slave labor, and they produced staples to supply urban market and slave ships. So in this context of growth of the slave trade in West Central Africa, they entered the transatlantic slave trade. Some of these women entered the slave trade alone, while others entered in partnership with their European husbands. In the chapter 2 of the book, I explored the trajectory of 3 of these women slave traders, Dona Ana Joaquina, Dona Ana Ubertali, and Dona Ana Ifigenia. There are many Anas. So I explored the trajectory of these 3 women, and their trajectories present some similarities. For example, these women, they were all Luso-Africans. They married to European men, and all of them married more than once to European men. Again, these men, some of them died very quickly, so these women became widow when they were still very young, so they married again. And also these women, something common among them is that they had accumulated capital to the foodstuff trade before entering the Atlantic market. So in spite of the participation of women, the slave trade was controlled by men, especially men of Portuguese and Luso-African origin. And these men, they had access to capital, and they also had positions in the colonial administration in the Portuguese militias. So in theory, these men were not supposed to be engaged in slave trading. So in the chapter 3 of the book, I look at the profile of supplies of foodstuff to the Terreiro Público, that was the Luanda public market, and also to the slaughterhouse. So basically, these are the suppliers of beans, manioca flour, and also corn or maize, and also of beef to the city. And once more, looking at the records of the Terreiro Público, what I see here is the foodstuff supply was also controlled by men. The main traders involved in the supply of food were all men. although women compose the majority of the labor force producing this foodstuff in the arinos and in the farms in the interior. Whether we are considering here free labor or enslaved labor, the majority of the labor force was women. And again, these men, they were military and administrative personnel, and they were also religious men. So this cycle of prosperity that initiated in 1815 ended in 1836 when Portugal banned slave exports from its overseas territories in Africa. So thereafter, the Portuguese established the Tribunal das Presas, or the prize court, to prosecute smugglers of captives. And in 1842, Portugal and Great Britain agreed on the establishment of an office of the Mixed Commission at Luanda. So again, to prosecute illegal slave traders. So basically, because of the presence of warships in the coast of West Central Africa, by mid-1840s, slave exports from Luanda was virtually non-existent. So we didn't see after 1836, especially by mid-1840s, there was basically no shipment of captives leaving from the port of Luanda and from the African-controlled ports. Let me change here, sorry. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that slave traders based in Luanda had ended their participation in the slave trade. Actually, what they did to escape the policing of the warships, they moved their activities from Luanda to other smaller ports to the north and the south of the colony. And you can see here in this map, the main locations where they were shipping captives illegally from West Central Africa. So they moved their activities to this smaller port that it didn't attract much attention from the British and the Portuguese warships. So from these smaller locations, they continued to ship captives all the way to the late 1860s, especially to Brazil and Cuba. Colonial officials in Luanda had a very difficult task because they had to enforce the law at the same time that the colonial state depended on the generosity of slave traders. So again, the colonial state depended on the support of the local elite, and this local elite was mainly composed of slave traders. So, for example, slave traders donated the food that fed the patients in the hospital. They donated the food that fed the military personnel in the colony. They also landed the ships for the colonial government and supplied labor for the public works undertaken by the Portuguese administration. So what we see is that after the end of the slave trade, in 1836, these individuals that were engaged in the illegal slave trade, they were being granted titles of nobility, and they also continued to hold positions in the Portuguese administration. Some of them were even able to compose the Mixed Commission office at Luanda, in spite of the fact that they were involved in this illegal slave trade. So the final blow to the trade in West Central Africa happened in 1850 when Brazil enacted a law that ended the importation of captives into the country. So after 1850, some small-scale merchants left Angola and they relocated their business in Brazil, Portugal, and also to a lesser extent in New York City. Large-scale merchants, however, continue shipping captives illegally to Cuba, and colonial authorities in Luanda and also in Angola, in Portugal, expected the new trade in tropical commodities to replace the slave exports. However, what I see in my research is that the two trades proved to be complementary rather than mutually exclusive. So large-scale slave traders continue shipping captives illegally at the same time that they invested in legitimate commerce. So What I show in my research is that the capital invested in the cotton and coffee plantations, as well as in the sugar mills. We have a lot of sugar mills that will pop up in Angola at this time. And also in the trade in wax and ivory. This capital originated in the legal and illegal slave trade. Okay. So Luanda's slavers also remained central to the advancement of credit in the colony. So it illustrates their resiliency as a class. So in 1846, the Royal Treasury issued an authorization for some merchants in Luanda so that they were able to advance credit to anyone interested in the colony, basically small scale merchants. So here you can see the list of merchants that had authorization to issue bills of credit in Luanda. And then you can see from the list, many of these individuals, they were smugglers of captives. They were involved in the illegal slave trade. I highlighted in bold the individuals that were slave traders. And another factor that we can see from this list is that the advancement of credit in the colony during the era of legitimate commerce continued to be controlled by men. We can see three women that made it to the list: Dona Ana Joaquina do Santo Silva, Dona Ana Francisca Albertalli, and Dona Delfina Vieira. But the other 30 individuals were all men. That means that men continued to dominate, to control the advancement of credit in the colony during the era of legitimate commerce, as they had done before during the era of the transatlantic slave trade. So I will end my presentation here so that we can have a discussion and I can hear your questions and your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. If you can just stop sharing your screen like this, we can see you. Yeah, here we go. Then let's see if you have any questions, just go and raise your hand by clicking on reactions at the bottom of the screen. We are also on YouTube. If you have questions on YouTube, you can ask those questions too. Tatiana Seijas, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you very much, Vanessa, for your presentation. I look forward to reading the book once I get to my office where it is. I have a question for you about the pricing of food in the market in Luanda. I've been thinking a lot about how you can account for pricing change based on supply and demand, and how women can get involved in that pricing. So I wondered if you have any comments about how that played out and if that changed over time during the first half of the 19th century.
So do I respond now or we get more questions?
Yeah, go ahead. You respond to each of the questions separately.
Okay, so thank you for your question. So the price of foodstuff varied a lot, and mainly it depended on the environmental conditions. So basically in times of droughts, for example, the price of foodstuff could go very high, especially because of the scarcity of foodstuff. And also one of the governors of Angola, Coutinho, he complained that some individuals took advantage of these environmental conditions to monopolize the trade of foodstuff and also to increase the price. So even though they would have food that they could supply to the market, they would hold to this foodstuff so that the price would go high. So they try to create a shortage of food in the city to increase the prices and of course also increase their profits. So there was a lot of complaint from the governors of Angola regarding these tentative from merchants to control the price. Yeah, but there was some, the government tried to stipulate price to foodstuff, but it didn't always work. because of the environmental issues and also the ambition of some merchants. And again, most of these merchants, they were men. At least in the 19th century, the supply of food was mainly controlled by men. So women, although they produced this food stuff, they didn't have much of a say on the price.
Thank you, Vanessa. You have a question from Alex Baruki. Okay.
Thank you, Vanessa, for the book. Great maps, by the way. I really like when I can follow the story through the maps as well and see the places. I want to ask you if you perceive that as the transatlantic slave trade became, let's say, more and more illegal in Luanda, but also in other places, it also became more and more international, including agents outside of Lusophone or Luso-African communities in Luanda. I'm asking this, and you may think where I'm going with this. I'm asking more specifically if you found increasing participation, for instance, of Spaniards or Cubans in your Portuguese sources. I saw, for instance, that you mentioned a Spanish-born woman that was the wife of a surgeon in one example, that this woman was punishing an enslaved African. And in the chapter that goes into more the part of the effects of the illegalization, you suggest, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misreading you, that some of the Luanda-based slave traders actually left Luanda after 1850, going to join international networks like in Portugal, Brazil, and New York, rather than this internationalization coming to Luanda, rather than Spaniards or Americans or Cuban trying to settle in Luanda, or in places like in these ports north and south of Luanda that you point after 1836 and increasingly after 1850. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. In the final phase of the slave trade, but before the suppression of the slave trade in 1836, we have the appearance of some other players in the slave trade. For example, we had Americans coming to Angola and establish themselves in Luanda. And again, some of them would marry with local women. We also had some Dutch individuals who would come to Luanda to open business. And of course, after the suppression of the slave trade, these men would state that they were dealing in the, like legal commodities, but many of them are also engaged in the illegal slave trade. So yeah, we do have some new players coming in the final phase of the slave trade. And yes, so small-scale traders, small-scale merchants, some of them had business that were indirectly connected to the slave trade. So for example, some of these individuals, they were producing foodstuff to supply slave ships, or they had warehouses and shops in the city that were mainly to supply goods to slave traders. So after 1850, when Brazil ended the importation of captives, some of these individuals, they will leave. They leave Angola and they relocated their business elsewhere because they couldn't maintain their business. And even like Roquinaldo Ferreira, he will argue that also some shop owners that didn't have business directly connected to the slave trade, they will leave because they usually got suppliers from these slave ships that were coming to the city. But because the slave ships were not coming to Luanda anymore, so they didn't get any supplies. So they closed their business in Angola and they move elsewhere. So yeah, so we have these individuals also like the exodus of individuals leaving Angola. But the large-scale merchants, they did stay and they continued their business in the slave trade and also initiated their investments in the legitimate commerce.
Thank you, Vanessa. Do we have any other questions that I don't see them? Then I will jump to ask one question to Vanessa. Then I would like, then of course that this is a book that we have been waiting for a very long time. Among other things, we know that there is not much in terms of books published regarding women during the period that you are looking at, and the previous period as well. And I have questions regarding these donas, the ones that you examine more in detail, including, of course, Ana Joaquina. Would like to know, in terms of what you found and how much did you find about her, because of course in the book we have material, but not necessarily, the book is not about her, it's not a biography. And I forgot the name of that journalist who was doing a book. What is her name, my God?
Lynn Duke.
Lynn, yes, because I met her several times, and unfortunately he is not among us anymore, and that book never came out. But it seems that there is a lot of material, or perhaps there are, because of course, then as a historian, she was a journalist, then I don't know exactly how much she found about Ana Joaquina. Then my question would be, how many of these big merchants do we have material that is available that we could study them, could write about them, and conduct research for people who want to do research on this topic? And about Ana Joaquina itself, if it would be possible for you to give us a broader overview of her, because she is the most well-known, and tell us what is available about her as well. Then I would have a second question, or third, that would involve the travels of these, because I know that you and especially Mariana as well have been working on these women who also traveled to Brazil and conducted business in Brazil during this period and the period before. One of the interesting elements that I found interesting in this book, that and I use in a chapter of a book that I am writing, is the fact that these women, they would go to Brazil, and some of these women, they also traveled as passengers in slave ships. And also, of course, all the entire issue of women having access to property, which I think that, and to being slave owners and trading in enslaved people as well, which is connected to the work that Jessica Johnson did in the region of Senegambia, Hilary Jones as well, but also here in the United States with the work of Stephanie Jones Rogers, that all this discussion about then white women who own property and who own and trade in enslaved people. But here you have women that are African women. Also another element regarding Ana Joaquina that I was very surprised the other day, we were discussing on social media, how did she look like? And in my mind, she was a woman who looked like a Black woman. And then in that sort of reconstitution that you did, that you, Katrina, did with computer, then software, she looks almost like a white woman. And this is interesting because in the Bight of Benin, for example, these Luso-Africans, they are people who are still there in the region, and many of them, for people who do not know, they are Luso-Africans. We can know because of their Portuguese names, but they do a lot of, they look like people who do not have any kind of European ancestry. Then I don't know if you would like to comment on this. It's a little bit long and confusing.
No, it's very clear. These are great questions, and I try to respond to your questions. So you work about your first question is about sources, about how much material there is out there about these big merchants, about these women. Um, Once I was told that I would maybe not be able to write a thesis on women. My PhD, this book derives from my PhD dissertation, and the dissertation was on women merchants, although in the book I also bring the men. So there are a lot of sources out there. You will find a lot of these merchants, especially when we are dealing with women merchants, you'll find these women everywhere. Of course, there are some silence, especially when we are dealing with travel accounts, because these travel accounts were written by men, and men usually interact with other men. And they not always mention women. They didn't pay attention to women. Although most travelers who passed by Luanda, they could not neglect Dona Ana Joaquina. Most of them, they do mention her because she was so important in the city. She was well respected. And she had close contact with the Portuguese government in Angola that, everybody mentioned her. So yes, there's a lot of material about these big women, these women merchants and slave traders, especially in the documentation of the municipal library in Luanda. There is a wealth of documentation about the trajectory of these women, not just these big merchants, but also about the quitanderas, that were the street vendors. So there's a lot of information on these women. Most of this is a quantitative information. Of course, you had to be creative to work with this information, but you find the name of these women, you find places where they were working, and you can try to reconstitute their trajectories. On the other hand, it's more difficult to find information about enslaved women, for example. So that's a big challenge to try to reconstruct the trajectories and the experiences of enslaved individuals. About Dona Ana Joaquina, so you mentioned the work of Lini Duke. That was the journalist. She was based in DC, if I'm not mistaken, and she was able to collect a wealth of material on Dona Ana Joaquina. I met with her a couple of times. She came to Toronto and to meet Professor Joseph Curto and myself, and she did a wonderful work. She collected a lot of material. Of course, she was a journalist, so not always she was concerned with things that we historians are concerned. But unfortunately, like, she passed away and we didn't see the book. There is a lot of material out there about Dona Ana Joaquina. I didn't use all the material I have about her because the book was not about Dona Ana. But for example, in the National Archive in Angola, we can find commercial causes, like commercial dealings of Dona Ana Joaquina. As well, we can find the judicial documentation. Sometimes she had to bring people to court because she had advanced money to local merchants, and sometimes this money didn't get back to her, so she had to bring people to court. So this make very interesting case because many times she was fighting with men to make sure these men would pay back whatever they owned to her. And Dona Ana Joaquina, again, she was a very interesting character. I'll just tell a little bit about her. So Dona Ana Joaquina was a Luso-African, as you might get from her name. So her father was military official. So he was an officer in the Portuguese army, and he was sent to Angola. And in Angola, as was common, he entered a relationship with a local woman, with an African woman, and then they had a daughter. I don't know if it was their only children, but it was the only that survived at least. So Dona Ana Joaquina born from this intercultural marriage between a Portuguese and an African woman. And Dona Ana herself also married with Portuguese men. She married 3 times. Her first husband was a Portuguese military officer like her father. Her second husband was a Brazilian trader, and her third husband was a Portuguese trader. And she initially, when I look at her in the 19th century, early in the 19th century, she was a supplier of beans and manioca flour to the Luanda public market that was called the Terreiro Público. And she accumulated capital through the supply, the foodstuff supply, but also to her marriage. And she also inherited from her father when he passed away. And in this context of growth of the slave trade in West Central Africa in the early 19th century, she started her investment in the transatlantic slave trade. So she purchased 4 vessels, and we can actually find these vessels in the voyage database, and we can see where they were going to. So these vessels were shipping captives to Brazil. So she was shipping captives to Salvador and Recife and to Rio de Janeiro. And she became the wealthiest Luanda merchant. And I think your last question was about travel. So these women, they were traveling throughout the Atlantic world. And it's interesting, for example, Dona Ana Joaquina, she was used to travel to Brazil and also to Portugal, and she purchased property in Brazil and in Portugal. For example, she purchased land in Rio de Janeiro. She intended to establish a coffee plantation when we had the coffee boom in Brazil, but she died before being able to do it. And it's interesting that she died in one of these trips to Portugal. She died on board the vessel. She was going to Portugal to seek treatment for an illness, but she died on the travel. It's interesting that you mentioned the picture. I have the picture here of Dona Ana Joaquina. I can show later if we have time. I hope I answer all your questions.
Wonderful. You asked it. But really, it's a fascinating character, and I hope you or someone else will take her and write this book about her. Lynn is no longer with us, and I think that she would love to see this, a book about Ana Joaquina published. Thank you, Vanessa. Do we have more questions or comments?
I think we have a question here in the chat. If you
yes. Okay, then let me just read for you, and you have Chin Soriano also. Then this is coming from Shihan de Silva. And the question is, you mentioned that Luso-Africans were classified as white. What are the other categories that existed in Luanda or Angola? Thanks.
Okay, so this is a great question, because then I have the chance to talk a little bit more about the composition, the makeup of the Luanda population. So the colonial government classified people into 3 groups. So there was the white population, and the white population was mainly the Portuguese and the Brazilian men that were coming in, but also some of these mixed race individuals that were classified as white, so they were Luso-Africans. There were also the Pardos. Pardos was people of mixed ancestry, so they were the offspring of these European men with local women. And here you can see how these categories, they were not really biological. It had a lot to do with social construct and with power and economics. So Joseph Miller says that, he was used to say that money whitened people in Angola as it did in Brazil. So again, a Luso-African individual could be classified as white, but also as pardos. So they usually would be classified as white or pardos, even though if they were black, it was most likely that they would be classified as pardos, not as blacks, just because these were individuals of high socioeconomic status. Or sometimes they would just be silent about the skin color of these individuals. So they would have their names, but they wouldn't say anything about their skin colors. And then there was the Black population. This was mainly the Mibundu population. But again, remember that Luanda was a slave hub. So you have individuals coming from everywhere. Some of these enslaved Africans, they stay in the city, but others, they stay for a while waiting for shipment to the Americas. And Luanda was a slave society itself. So enslaved Africans stay in the city where they work in the sobrados and also in the city. They did all kinds of work in the city. And there were free Africans too who lived in the city. And again, although sometimes because I'm talking about these Luso-African individuals and these traders, we might get an impression that Luanda was a kind of European society, but it wasn't at all. So most of the population in Luanda, they were Black Africans. So they composed most of the population, sometimes like 80–90% of the population were Black Africans. And Luanda was a Luso-African society. So we have this intermingling of European and African elements, but the African elements were always more important. For example, Kimbundu was the lingua franca. It was the official language in Luanda. So it took a lot of time. By mid-19th century, Kimbundu was still spoken in Luanda. And there was a lot of complaints by colonial authorities because people keep speaking Kimbundu in the city. So again, so you have the white population that was a minority. So whites never passed more than 9–10% of this population. You have the Pardo population, and then you have the Black population that was the majority of the population in the city.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. We have Chin Soriano now.
Hi, Vanessa. Again, thank you so much for a terrific book. I certainly learned a great deal. I had a question out of chapter 3 and the foodstuffs, especially beef and the supplying of beef. You had mentioned in your sources, one was the Convent de Carmel, and what I'm more interested in is the Tram Real to the beef suppliers to the military. Do you have, could you maybe tell me a little bit more about how the quartermaster system work? Because I would assume it's not only they're supplying the beef to the military on land, but I'm especially interested in the amount of beef that would be going out to warships, especially patrolling off the coast during the time of slave ship interdictions. I know in the case of the Royal Navy, men ate a tremendous amount of beef, and they were being supplied by individual women suppliers in Freetown, for example, to the Royal Navy warships directly. Here you have them, from what I understand, going through a market system in that sense. So if you could maybe flesh out, so to speak, a little bit more about how the beef production worked in that sense, with the sources that you have.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so basically, as you can imagine, because of the environmental conditions in Angola, it wasn't easy to raise cattle. Mm-hmm. So there was some specific place in the highlands where it was possible to raise cattle, and usually it was a high valued commodity. Whether we are talking among indigenous populations, and again, the indigenous population, they didn't consume the beef. It was more for rituals and for celebrations like the burial of the Sobas, that were the African chiefs. And eventually there was a few occasions when they would eat beef, but it wasn't usual. So mainly we have individuals who are able to trade in cattle. These were wealthy individuals. For example, the father of Dona Ana Joaquina do Santo Silva, he traded in cattle, in spite of the fact that he was a military official. So he was not supposed to be engaged in the local trade, but he became a cattle trader. And then, as you can see, some of these individuals, so then they would raise the cattle in the interior, and sometimes there were women who were also cattle owners, like was Dona Máxima Botelho de Vasconcelos that I mentioned in the book. And some individuals would also raise cattle within the city limits that were forbidden in the bylaws, the municipal bylaws, but they did it anyway.
Right.
And I guess so this cattle, it would go through the city. It had to pass through the municipal slaughterhouse where the cattle would be killed and cleaned. And then after that, people who own taverns in the city and also shops, they could go to the slaughterhouse to buy meat that they could resell in these shops throughout the city. And some individuals also sold in their houses, although it was illegal.
Right.
So I couldn't tell for sure how much of this meat was going to the military, although this information is available in the sources, because these sources, they show the amount of meat that was bought by individuals and also by institutions. And then this information is out there. It's just, it was not something that I was concerned about. But the information is available in the primary source. So basically, these transaction books that we can find in the records of the Terreiro Público and also the slaughterhouse, they show the date of entry of the beef and how many arrobas of beef, like the amount, the quantity, and who was supplying the cattle and who was buying that, and how much they bought, how much they paid. So all this information is in the transaction books.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you. And we have now a question from Esteban Salas. Let me just add the spotlight.
Thank you. I'm really happy to have the discussion and have finally this book out. I was waiting for looking forward to see this out for a long time. Nice to see you, Vanessa, and everyone. So my question, Vanessa, is as to the way you chose to guide your narrative about the free women, right, the donas, but also rich merchants and people providing the colonial city with foodstuffs and with enslaved people, or captives first, and that would turn into enslaved people. So I wonder if you came across instances of resistance, not only to eventually participating in the slave trade, participating in the enslavement of people locally, but also in the expansion of colonialism. Because if the colonial administration is having some opinion as to where Lusophone traders and agricultural producers can have their arimos, right, or their later plantations, it means that, well, they have to occupy the territory and they have to set rule there, right? So my question is in two terms. Well, is there any position by these rich merchants that goes against the effort of colonization of the Portuguese? If there is, why didn't you highlight this? Is it not as easily to see this in the sources as it is perhaps to see their collaboration with the colonial state, which is part of what I'm guessing. And then the other part would be, what about people who are not as rich and are still trading? Are these people, for example, trading to or providing with foodstuff supplies to traders in the interior of Luanda and gaining some credit from that, gaining some currency, for example, for them to use it, right? So I know some of these questions, right, are beyond the book, which is okay if we can also discuss later about this. But I'm mostly curious about to why you chose this type of narrative that highlights collaboration with a project that extends colonialism, the slave trade, and enslavement in African societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. It's nice to see you too. So it's just some friend faces here. And thank you for your question. I think it's a very important question. And I think first, in a short answer, no. I didn't find in the sources that was looking at any resistance for these individuals, but then it has to do with the group of individuals that I'm looking at, right? Because I'm looking at slave traders and I'm looking at individuals that are actually benefiting from colonialism, who are connected to the colonial state. And these individuals, because they were slave traders, so they were not against the enslavement of people. So again, my searches are limited in this sense because I'm looking at this category of individuals. Although we find resistance when we look at the enslaved population, these individuals, they did resist slavery. There is the last chapter of the book. I look at the enslaved population of Luanda after the era of slave trading, so many during the era of legitimate commerce, how these individuals engaged in legitimate commerce in the city and also in the interior. And then we see that enslaved Africans, they did resist slavery. So by running away or by purchasing their own manumission. So we do have cases, and I explore some of these cases in the last chapter of the book. But again, because the individuals I look at, they were benefiting from the status quo of things in Angola, so they didn't resist colonialism. And also because I'm looking at Luanda, so Luanda is the administrative capital of Angola. So you have all the Portuguese bureaucracy at this place, and this bureaucracy were connected to the local elite. We can also think here that many of these individuals, even Luso-African individuals, they also had positions in the administration. So they were collaborating with the Portuguese administration. And some of them, they were also observed by the Portuguese military in Angola. So they would be appointed as commanders of presidios or administrative unities in the interior that would give them access to slaves actually in the interior that they could export across the Atlantic Ocean. So I don't know if this responds to your question, but I'm sure if we look at all the areas like probably like out of Luanda or in other categories of people in Luanda itself, we will find resistance. We will find people who didn't benefit from the system and people who are more likely to resist. But unfortunately, this is not the case of the people that I'm looking at the book. They were actually benefiting from colonialism and from the slave trade. I don't know if it responds to your question.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Vanessa. We have two other questions, then Rafael Gonçalves and then Kate De Luna. Let me just do Rafael.
Good night, Vanessa. Thank you so much for your presentation. At the conclusion of your book, you mentioned the absence of references in Luanda's public memory about the role played by local slave dealers. Today, at the same time that historians are complexifying these dynamics and reinforcing the role of Africans in the slave trade, people who oppose to anti-racist policies argue that Africans were the main slave traders, especially here in Brazil. How do you, as a historian and scholar, seek to communicate the role played by sertanejos, Luso-Africans, and donas in light of this dispute of narratives? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great question. And this is the second time that someone asked this question. I've been asked this question before. And I guess this is a question that arises every time that we talk about the role played by Africans in the transatlantic slave trade. And I think it's important that we do recognize the role played by Africans, that we also know where the profit, like the great profit of the transatlantic slave trade was going to. Again, as I show in my book, Luso-Africans were involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but most traders, they were of Portuguese origin. Especially in the case of Luanda, most traders, they were actually Portuguese and Brazilians. So the profit of the slave trade, although we do have some elites in Angola benefiting from the slave trade and having access to imported goods that they could display as signs of distinction, most of the profit of the slave trade was actually in Brazil and in Portugal, in these big commercial firms that were controlling the slave trade in Angola. So again, I think it doesn't challenge the great narrative that most of the profit went to other places. It didn't stay in Angola. Even though we had, for example, in the case of West Africa, we have some predatory states that were formed because of the transatlantic slave trade, as was the case of Dahomey, and we had the enrichment of some individuals because of the transatlantic slave trade. But we cannot deny that most of this capital was being sent out of Angola and not really staying in Angola. So I don't know if this responds to your question.
Thank you, Vanessa. And then you have Kate De Luna. I am just putting her.
Thank you. Vanessa, thank you for this presentation and for your wonderful book. I'm excited to teach with it. I wanted to ask you a question that isn't directly related to the content of your book, so that's unfair, but I'm highlighting your specialist expertise. I wanted to build on Dr. De Silva's question because you answered the question about racial categories largely in quite literally Portuguese terms. And I wondered if you might share with us some of the kinds of categories of identity politics that emerged both from Kimbundu and other languages of West Central Africa, because, you know, racial identities and categories, but also gender categories that you kind of know of from your position as a specialist of the region, but also as a sort of anthropologically minded historian. I was wondering if I could invite you to teach us something about that.
Okay, so basically just kind of trying to understand your question. So you want to know from like a Mimbudo point of view, what were the categories that people were maybe classified into?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that you taught us was that there were, you know, categories of personhood that, you know, inflected, you know, sort of categories that maybe could be even translatable into Portuguese. I guess I'm interested in whether there were categories emerging in West Central Africa itself that weren't as easily translated into Portuguese, or that persisted in terms that are Kimbundu or other sort of West Central African languages, right? So I guess on the one hand, this is a question about archives, right? So if many archives are generated through the sort of position of Portuguese speakers on the sort of West Central African coast, you know, what was the role or contribution of sort of African intellectual traditions into this kind of production of racial identities on the coast? And so one of the ways we might see this is through categories of identity that maybe persisted with Kimbundu names or these sorts of things. I was curious about whether you could teach us something about kind of categories of identity politics that are kind of really rooted, not necessarily in a sort of Portuguese translated archive. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think like maybe if we look more at the population of the interior, even the immediate hinterland of Luanda, where we have these farms and the arinos, so we will find all the categories of people who were more connected to the indigenous communities in Angola. And of course, these people, they have a different way of classifying the population. For example, people use scarifications, and we can see a lot of these in the registers, the records of enslaved Africans that were generated, again, by the Portuguese after 1854. And then, but again, they register this population and they show, for example, body marks like scarifications and tattoos in the body. And again, these signs in the body, these body marks, they mainly within African communities, the idea, what they signify was the categories of these individuals within that society. So they might show the position of that individual, they might show their occupation within that community. So this one was one of the forms to show identity, also affiliation to a certain ethnic groups. And again, we can see this in the Portuguese documentation. You mentioned the limitation with the sources, because most of the sources I look at and who are available for us, for Africanists, they have been written by Europeans, especially European men. So again, we have to read through these sources trying to find the African voice in it. So it's not always easy to find African voice, to find the Mibundu population, ethnic identifications within these sources. But there are some work done on these populations living in the hinterland that shows stratification, that shows, for example, individuals who are able to accumulate property. And you can see the work, for example, of Mariana Candido that has been showing that Africans were also interested in the accumulation of property, that rights in persons, that accumulating other people, whether these people are dependents or they were enslaved, was important. But Africans were also interested in material goods and in property. And of course, all of these serve as a sign of distinction. If you can control people, if you can control property, and if you have these global commodities that are circulating throughout the Atlantic world. So if you can display these goods, so that means that you are a person of distinction within that community. So there was stratification within that communities as well.
Yeah, if I can ask a follow-up, I mean, I guess I was wondering partly like, how do these European racialist ideologies translate into Kimbundu or other languages, right? Like there's this way in which, I mean, I don't know, further to the north of the river, you get mundele as a very common word for both an African trader, but also sort of blanc, right? Mm-hmm. And so I know this is also to the south of the river. And I guess I'm just curious, like what other ideas are in circulation that kind of reflect concepts that might be about naming Europeans through categories of thought emerging from the interior or the continent more generally. But it might be that I'm asking you a question that's like not about your book, and that's a little unfair. These are the sorts of naughty questions that we shouldn't be asking in fora.
I'm sure there was categories that were used by the Bimbundu population to identify these European, whether they were traders or they were, these administrative personnel. These categories, they don't show up in my sources, the sources at hand that I've analyzed so far, but I'm sure, they are out there in other documentation.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know about, like kind of where the categorization happens in sources.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, Kate. Do you have other questions? It's time to jump. We can go up to 6:30, but let's see if we have more questions. If not, I will ask a question. Oh, I have Claire Benz. Then let me just, Claire, do you want to turn on your video or just go ahead if you don't, please?
Awesome. If you can hear me, that's fine. It is
perfect.
Quite warm here today, so my video is staying off. Thank you, first of all, so much for this lovely book. I enjoyed it so much and learned so much. And I have a follow-up question about memory and public memory, because you, in the conclusion, mentioned the museum, but I'm wondering a little bit too about other spaces of public memory, like the house or even thinking about, is there any form of public commemoration marking the end of the trade and the official versus when it actually ended, or how over time different periods in the slave trade in Luanda are currently remembered there today?
Thank you for your question. And I will start with your comment on memory. So yeah, so in Luanda, we have a slavery museum. It's actually a little bit out of Luanda. It's not really within the urban area of the city. It's more to the south. And this museum, it's quite different nowadays. So there's a video available, and if anyone want to search, this museum has been through a renovation, a major renovation. But the first time I visited the museum, so basically the narrative displayed in the museum was mainly showing the slave trade solely as a foreign enterprise, especially a Portuguese enterprise. So it even doesn't highlight it much the role played by Brazilians, or maybe the Brazilians were together with the Portuguese, so they're part of a single group. But mainly we didn't see the role played by Africans in the slave trade in the museum anywhere. So again, recently the museum has gone through a major renovation, and in this new narrative that we see in the museum, they do mention very briefly the role played by Africans, but it's not, they don't highlight much the role played by Africans in the transatlantic slave trade. And other than the museum, we have the house of Dona Ana Joaquina do Santo Silva. There was like a gigantic building. So this building is still a part of the city architecture. So if you go to Angola and you go to the Bungo in the Cidade Baixa in the lower city, you will see, you know, it's very like, you can't miss it because it's a huge building. And again, this building, it was basically rebuilt because the original building, it was in a very bad status. So they had to put it down and rebuild, but they did respect the original architecture of the building. But again, until 2019, this building that was once the house of the main slave trader based in Luanda, it became the court, the provincial court in Angola. And there was no mention anywhere within the building of the role played by Dona Ana Joaquina in the transatlantic slave trade, or that she had been a slaver. And when I was in the city doing my research, I was to talk to people, and I would, you know, ask sometimes people, oh, have you ever heard about Dona Ana Joaquina? And a couple of times I got from people, oh yeah, she was a very good woman. She was very benevolent. She helped the African population. So there was like, even among the population itself, there was no knowledge of Dona Ana Joaquina or their, you know, her role in the transatlantic slave trade. Nowadays, this building is no longer the Provincial Court of Justice. It has been transferred elsewhere. So I actually don't know what has happened with the building right now. What's, you know, whether they still having any public institution there. And also, you ask about commemoration. To my knowledge, I don't know of any commemoration through the end of the slave trade in Luanda itself. I don't know if other people may ever heard about commemorations, but I never heard of any commemoration in Luanda about the end of the slave trade.
Thank you. I would just add a comment that the fact that the role of a slave merchant and the fact that a building does not have any reference to that, of course, is not a privilege of Luanda. Then we see this here in the United States, we see in Brazil and so on. Then I think that all this wave perhaps is still recent there. And in other African museums as well, the fact that African agents are usually not mentioned because these are initiatives to tourists usually, then we don't want to emphasize the participation of these agents. But there is nice work to be done. But I will ask you questions later. Now I have Rafael who has a question for you. Then I will just replace here.
Sorry for asking again, Vanessa. But I would like also to ask about chapter 3, where you did a great analysis of the supply of staples in Luanda, and considering the different situations of no compliance with the law that you mentioned, can we consider that the low participation of women and Africans in the Terreiro Público records is because they could supply directly to quitandeiras or to ships, for example? Or do you argue that the small producers always sought the mediation of rich merchants or the Terreiro Público to access the urban market? Thank you.
This is a great question because it was illegal to supply slave ships or the quitandeiras directly. So all the staple entry in the city had to go through the Terreiro Público. And the whole idea here was to collect the tax. So basically, these staples had to go through the Terreiro so that the Terreiro could wage these staples and also tax the suppliers. So this money that was collected by the Terreiro went to the municipal council, and it was supposed to be invested in the infrastructure of the city. If the money was used for that, we don't know. The documentation show a lot of corruption in the Terreiro Público. There is a lot of information on the Terreiro. There's a lot of documentation in the municipal library, and there is always this discussion about corruption, to the point that by the 1853, the government actually privatized the administration of the Terreiro because it wasn't working. The officials that work in the Terreiro Público, they work for the Portuguese administration, but they are always involved in corruption. They were receiving bribes from traders, and they were manipulating the price of food in the city. They were charging people to issue the tax bills, and there was a lot of issues going on in the Terreiro. Although it was illegal, there was individuals who try to have access to foodstuff coming out of the Terreiro. So many of these individuals, especially quitandeiras, were often accused of that, of not buying their products in the Terreiro Público, but going all the way to the interior. Especially there was this path to Calumbo. Calumbo was one of the areas that were like the basket of Luanda where they produced food. So they would go halfway to Calumbo to buy these foodstuffs directly from producers. And then they would go back to the city. If it was true or not, we don't know, but there was a lot of complaints coming from shopkeepers. They were mainly Portuguese and Luso-Africans. They would complain about the quitandeiras and would say that they were not following the law, that they were buying their foodstuffs somewhere else. But there was a lot of disputes between shop owners and quitandeiras, because quitandeiras, they were mobile, right? So they could reach the population much easier, and they could also negotiate with people more directly. And there was a lot of animosity between shop owners and quitandeiras. So they were often accused of being smugglers, of buying food indirectly out of the Terreiro. This is something that I explore in a paper that was published in the Canadian Journal of African Studies last year. So if that's something that you are interested, I could send you the paper later. You can send me an email and I'll be happy to send you the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Do we have any other questions waiting? I will ask then, one question to Vanessa, related then to the next project that you are planning. Then after this book, what I see in the book, and this is what happens, I think, with topics that is still needed to, that there is not much is still written about, especially regarding women during this period and the previous period. We are waiting for the book of Mariana Cândido that will be out soon, and her new project as well. But I ask myself, from this book, what is you are planning for the next project, and if it is related to this book as well.
I have two other projects. One of them I've been working on for a while now. I started working on this project during my postdoc at the University of Toronto, and it's mainly the focus is on the enslaved population of Luanda. So I'm looking at the enslaved population within the city and also in the hinterland of Luanda. So mainly I'm looking at the experience of enslaved men and women in an urban setting and also in a rural setting. So individuals work in the city and also in these coffee and cotton plantations. So how different were their experiences? So again, here I'm looking at a later period, because then I will be looking at the era of legitimate commerce. And another project that I'm working on recently is on the illegal slave trade. So mainly I'm trying to look at the actions of the Portuguese Prize Court and also the Mixed Commission in Luanda. The Mixed Commission in Luanda was quite inefficient when we look at their actions in Luanda, and we compare with other office of the Mixed Commission throughout the Atlantic world. So it was a very inefficient office. And I've been looking at the papers of the Mixed Commissions that were generated by British authorities and by Portuguese authorities. There was a lot of complaints. For example, in my research, I came across individuals that were sitting in the Mixed Commission, but they were actually slave traders. So I guess it might explain a lot why they were so inefficient, because they were engaged in slave traders. Some of them, they were friends with slave traders. They were using their carriage. They were sleeping at their house, like they were basically becoming best friends. So again, I'm looking at these two institutions, and I'm trying to understand why we had these two institutions and still we had more than 300,000 enslaved Africans that were shipped illegally from West Central Africa after 1836. So it shows that these institutions were very inefficient. So these are the two projects that I'm trying to work on these days.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Then I want to thank you all who attended the meeting today. And again, just to remind you that this is the book that we read today, Slave Trade and Abolition, Gender, Commerce, and Economic Transition in Luanda by Vanessa Oliveira, published in 2021 with University of Wisconsin Press. And I want to invite you to come to the next Slaveryarchive Book Club. Then again, let me just see here. This is the book that we're going to discuss on next Wednesday, July the 7th, Relative Races, Genealogy of Interracial Kinship in 19th Century America. And this is by Brigitte Fielder. This is a book published last year by Duke University Press. Brigitte, she teaches at University of Wisconsin. And then get the book. If you didn't, register on www.slaveryarchive.wordpress.com. You are going to be here at 5 p.m. until 6:30 p.m. And again, a big thanks to all of you who came here today. And just let me just highlight my co-hosts here. Then Vanessa Holden, thank you so much for co-hosting, and also Alex Hill, thank you so much for being with us. and hope to see you next week at 5 p.m. Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone, have a great